Hello and welcome to the Journal. I'm Steve Kendall. The debates are over and we are less than a week away from Election Day 2020. Ohio and Wood County will play key roles in the outcome of the presidential race. And here to talk about that, provide some insight and some analysis into this whole process is Dr. Melissa K. Miller, professor in the Department of Political Science at Bowling Green State University. Dr. Miller, welcome to the Journal today.
Great to be here, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Now, I mentioned the debates are now over, and I know that we had talked, I think, before the first debate, and obviously the second and last debate took place. So could we talk just a little bit about what those debates did or didn't do? Did they alter? Did they change anybody's minds? What were the perceptions maybe of each of the candidates after the debates, that kind of thing? So how important were those debates this year?
Very important. Let's start with the first debate, and it was unforgettable. So even though it was now 2.5 weeks ago, I'm sure viewers who even just saw the clips on social media or on the news afterwards will not forget that debate was almost unwatchable, I think it's fair to say. And I heard Trump supporters and Biden supporters complain about it. It was just resolutely panned as an exercise in civic democracy, in civic engagement, to watch that debate. And it was because there was just constant interruption, talking over one another, ad hominem attacks. It was very difficult to even follow the thread of the argument that each candidate would make when posed a question about an important issue. They'd barely get started and be interrupted. Now, there were, some will say, well, the president did more of the interrupting. And I think there were counts that were done. And I love this in social science because it's the kind of thing a social scientist can do, right? So if the perception is the president did more of the interrupting, it's possible, right, to watch with a counter and count how many times. And indeed, he did interrupt more than former Vice President Biden. On the other hand, Biden himself, people complained, engaged in these ad hominem attacks against the president. It was unpleasant, Steve. Right. It was unpleasant.
Yeah, it was not. Yeah, it was not what we're used to seeing, even in I guess in any other debate we've ever seen at the presidential level. Nothing ever had hit that style through the entire length of the debate. So it was different. Right.
Now, here's why that debate mattered. Biden's lead widened after that debate. All right. So Biden got some traction out of that debate and has really been able to hold on to a steady lead since that debate. And by the way, he led prior to that debate. So it really, I think, solidified his frontrunner position. Now, his frontrunner position is not some kind of slam dunk, right? And we only have to look back to 2016 to remind ourselves that one should never get out ahead of, an election and try to predict the winner when it's still now, 5-6 days to go before the election. And so that lead it's tight in some of the battleground states, especially Ohio. Ohio is a toss-up once again this year. The other toss-up states are Iowa, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina. So we're in the company of some other states. We, of course, in Ohio are a key battleground state, which I can come back to. But let me just say a couple more things about the debates. So what happened, as you reminded the viewers, is that the second debate was canceled after the president contracted the coronavirus. The third debate was like watching an entirely different set of candidates, an entirely different form. I mean, it was really something. Now, the president had complained that the mute button was going to be used. The moderator, Kristen Welker of NBC News, didn't actually have a mute button. This was done in the control room. When she posed a question to each of the candidates, they were given 2 minutes to respond. And during that 2-minute time, their rival's mic was muted. And it made the debate so much more watchable, right? And it made the debate seem very characteristic of many other debates that we've watched every 4 years for decades. So that second debate was really much more chock full of contrast between the candidates on the issues. And there were some real key ones. So on the coronavirus, President Trump thinks that the coronavirus federal response has been successful, whereas Joe Biden thinks the polar opposite. In terms of health insurance, the president defended the decision to try to eliminate Obamacare in a Supreme Court case that the administration is going to be arguing on November 10th before the highest court. Joe Biden, of course, is opposed to that and criticized the president for not having a plan to replace it. And on the federal minimum wage, Joe Biden supports a federal $15 minimum wage. Donald Trump thinks it should be left to the states. I could go on. What was refreshing about all of that is that you could listen and hear the differences, and voters, that sliver who are still undecided, could hear the information and weigh how they felt about each of the candidates' issue positions. So that debate was important because it was really a last chance for each of the candidates to face a huge, multi-million viewing audience and reach some of those undecided voters who haven't decided yet.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about undecided voters, we've got just a minute or two here in this segment. Are there truly a lot of undecided voters at this point, or have the lines pretty much been drawn? So were they addressing what size of an audience of undecided voters were they trying to reach at that point? Or is this pump up my base, was that the approach?
I'll say two things. One is it differs. So if you look at the national polls, most recently there was a national poll that said 7% were still undecided. That seemed a little bit high to me. In Ohio, the numbers I've seen in recent polls are just 3 to 4% of voters. But let me say this. Voters who are undecided at this late stage, they tend to be what we call low information voters. They're not like the rah-rah partisans on each side who are, like opening their phone every morning before they even get out of bed to see what the latest headlines is. Undecided voters tend to pay less close attention, although they hold the key to this election outcome. And so, they are that sliver. Now, I'll just lastly say this difference between each candidate's base and the undecided voters, it is always in every election year so tricky for a candidate to figure out how to both rev up their base and generate intense enthusiasm to get them to turn out while also appealing to voters in the middle. And in 2020, it is absolutely the case. President Trump is a classic example. He has done an incredible job of rallying his base, and he has passionate support among his base. His ability to reach the undecided voters, we'll see. We'll see. His message that appeals to his base isn't necessarily the same message that's going to appeal to undecided voters in the middle.
Okay. And when we come back, we talked briefly at the front of this, I mentioned, Ohio and Wood County. So we'll drill down into Ohio a little bit, since we are one of those states that tends to determine, is a swing state and tends to determine who the president will be. So we'll be back in just a minute with Dr. Melissa Miller from Bowling Green State University here on The Journal. Thank you for staying with us here on The Journal. Our guest is Dr. Melissa Miller from the Political Science Department at Bowling Green State University. We talked in general about the debates and kind of the approach that both candidates have taken. As is usually the case, Ohio is one of the states that people will watch on election night because it has been a predictor of who's going to win for many, many, many years. And again, it's a very hotly contested state. So what do we look at now at Ohio? Where are we 4 or 5 days away from Election Day in Ohio? It's still kind of a 50-50-ish sort of thing at this point, right?
That's right. It's a complete toss-up, and it has been for some weeks now. So if you look at the Real Clear Politics average, which is averaging the credible polls that are out there that have been done in Ohio, last week, I think Joe Biden led by maybe 1%. This week, the president leads by 0.6%. So, it's flipped a little. That is all within the margin of error. That is a complete toss-up. Now, you're absolutely right. And just to give viewers a sense of what we mean when we say Ohio's picked the winner for years, you have to go all the way back to 1960 to find an election where Ohio gave its majority vote and thus its electoral college votes to the loser. So in 1960, a majority of Ohioans voted for Richard Nixon. So all of Ohio's electoral college votes went to Nixon, but John F. Kennedy became president. Right. So that was the last time that Ohio got it wrong. And if you go all the way back to 1896, Ohio has hands down the best record of picking the winner. So many have said that, sort of like in 2016, because Ohio picked Trump, that we were sort of out of step with, that maybe we were becoming more of a red state and less of a bellwether state. But my argument all along is because we picked Trump in 2016 is precisely why we retain our best in the country bellwether status.
Yeah, that was Ohio being Ohio is what it was then, basically.
That's right. Yeah. So let me quickly also say that the president must win Ohio to win re-election. All right. So essentially, the president has to carry every state, including Ohio, that he won in 2016. He can afford to lose just one of the big three, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Okay, right. So he can afford to lose one of them and still win. But his path is very narrow in that electoral college. It can be done, absolutely. And right. Not just Ohio, but other states are close. Whereas Joe Biden, he could afford to lose Ohio and still win. He has other paths to victory. But regardless, Ohio is such an important state. The president knows it. The president gave his first 2020 rally right here in Northwest Ohio in Toledo. He's been back here 2-3 times since then. Joe Biden has visited the state less, but that's also consistent with his doing, all kinds of campaign visits at a lower level than the president, who's with the coronavirus, who has nevertheless embraced the big rallies. And Joe Biden has eschewed them in light of the pandemic. So it's not as easy to kind of compare the numbers and say which candidate is prioritizing Ohio more. It's hard to say because one candidate is not even prioritizing campaign rallies at this point, right? And the other is.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Wisconsin, Michigan, and then there's Pennsylvania, which also is somewhat hotly contested. So there's that strip through there of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and that seems like where this will be won or lost will be in that strip of states, including Ohio. But as you said, Ohio, Trump can win, has to have Ohio to win. Biden doesn't necessarily have to have Ohio, but that means he needs to win the other three then, or at least it looks like. So there's that situation there. Yeah.
Yeah, and the competition in terms of sort of other battleground states that could figure more heavily than Ohio and that strip, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, it's the Sun Belt states. Right. So if the Sun Belt states, Arizona, Georgia, Florida, Texas is in play much closer than anyone would have imagined. And so if those start flipping, they all voted for Trump in 2016. If they flip to Biden, then Biden, that's how you can see Biden wouldn't need Ohio. Biden wouldn't necessarily need Pennsylvania if he can win Texas, which is just a treasure trove of electoral college votes. But I'll believe it when I see it. There are a lot in Texas who are saying Texas is becoming a swing state. There have been a lot of demographic changes in Texas. So the composition of that electorate has changed. But as I said, I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, and I saw another analyst say the same thing, that, was saying basically every 4 years they tell me Texas is going to vote for a Democratic president, and every 4 years it doesn't happen. And this is just what you said. And this person said the same. When it happens, I'll believe it, but don't tell me it's going to happen because I haven't seen it yet. Now, Arizona, those states. What about North Carolina? Because it tended to be thought of as more of a blue state, but now it seems to be moving. It's kind of a contested state again.
Right, and thank you for correcting me. I should have included North Carolina in that list of Sun Belt states and also states that are too close to call. Right. So North Carolina is an interesting state. It backed Barack Obama twice, in 2008 and 2012, and then it went for Trump in 2016. Now it's in play again in 2020, and it's one of these too close to call states. So that's another one to keep your eye on. Now, what viewers need to know is on election night, it is highly unlikely that we will know the outcome of the election.
Okay.
So I think viewers need to prepare. Maybe during COVID, I don't think there will be the big election night watch parties, but people might want to plan on, a nightly happy hour, right, for a week or two, to watch as the ballots get counted. And so that viewers understand, it's always the case that states have a period after the election to count the votes.
Right.
It's always the case. So there's nothing fishy about it taking beyond election day to count the ballots. And it's just that we're accustomed to knowing on election night. Why? Because in normal elections, meaning non-pandemic elections, people either vote in person early or they vote on election day.
Right.
And those ballots get instantly tabulated.
Right.
I shouldn't say instantly, but here in Ohio, for instance, on the touch screen, that's that vote is getting registered right away. And the difference now is that at the time of our conversation here, over 60 million voters have voted early, and millions are voting by mail. Mail meaning absentee, because of the pandemic. And so when you look at a situation where states have millions of ballots, even just the envelopes to open, think about that. Like, imagine sitting at your kitchen table and having to open 250,000 envelopes. All right. Now, fortunately, I think there's machinery that does it, but it's such a long process. And so in some states, you can't start counting those absentee ballots until election day. Now, Ohio is not one of them. Those ballots can be processed and counted in advance, although not the results revealed, and states allow the counting before election day, have laws on the books that say the results cannot be revealed, and that's as it should be. Right. But folks need to just be prepared that it could be some time before we know the outcome of the election.
Well, when we come back, let's talk about that, because I think people would be surprised to see how different the states are in terms of some of these election day, pre-election day, post-election day deadlines and dates and things. So let's talk about that, because on election night, people will, as we're an instant response society, we want to know yesterday what happened, today. And I think that's going to be the trick with this, is people will think they know or believe they know, and yet they'll find out that we're in this for the long haul, it looks like. So when we come back, we'll talk about that, where our guest is Dr. Melissa Miller from Bowling Green State University. Back on The Journal in just a moment. Thanks for staying with us on The Journal. We're talking about pre-election day, and we're a few days out from the actual day of voting, or at least one of the days of voting, I guess we should say. And our guest is Dr. Melissa Miller from Bowling Green State University. One of the things I think, and we've touched on this a little bit as we've gone through here, but each state is different on how you go about voting, and the early voting deadlines and the registration deadlines, all of that. And I think as citizens, we all think that, this is all very cut and dry. The rules are the same from state to state to state. And the reality is, each state has its own set of election laws. And that's as I think, as you may have mentioned at one point, that's sort of a federalist approach to this, that, let the states each manage their own elections, and they'll give us a number at the end of the day or at some point. But talk a little bit about how the states are different in a lot of ways. Even before you get to the actual voting, I mean, registration dates are different even.
That's right. You've mentioned a lot of the key differences that have affected every election that we've held since the founding, right? So different deadlines to register in Ohio versus Michigan versus Pennsylvania. Different rules for getting an absentee ballot and when the deadline is to request that. Different rules for when that absentee ballot has to be received. One of the interesting things to focus on in 2020, I think, because of the pandemic, many, many, many millions of people are voting by absentee ballot. It's essentially mail-in voting.
Right.
And they have different rules for when the counting can begin. And not only that, but just when the ballots can begin to be processed. So think about it. If you vote by mail, if you vote absentee, there are 2 envelopes, okay?
Right.
So there's an envelope in which you place your ballot that, the outside doesn't have identifying information about you. And then there's that exterior envelope that actually gets the postage, right? So different states vary in terms of even when you can begin processing. So for instance, in Michigan can only begin to open the envelopes, meaning process the ballots, the day before the election, and only in municipalities that have over 25,000 people in population. Whereas Ohio, those ballots can be processed before the election. And other states, it's different. In Florida, they can begin processing 22 days before. In Iowa, the Saturday before Election Day. So every state sets it up differently, and that is constitutional. The founders gave the states a lot of control in our federal system, and they control the rules even for the administration of our federal elections. So that's one interesting thing. Some states will be farther ahead than others in terms of processing those millions of mail-in ballots when Election Day comes because their state law allows it. I'll very quickly say then the actual counting of ballots that have been mailed in Michigan, those ballots can't be even counted until Election Day. Whereas in Ohio, they can be counted before Election Day, but the results can't be released. In Florida, again, it's that 22 days. In Iowa, you can't begin counting them until Election Day. So looking at those toss-up states, that's why we're going to see different states, and we'll be waiting longer for some than others. It's going to depend on how many mail-in ballots they got, what their laws are in terms of processing, opening the envelopes and having them ready to count versus actually count. So it is the way our system's set up. There's nothing fishy about it. It's just darn confusing, but it's the way we've been running elections for generations. We've just never had this volume of mail-in voting.
Right. Yeah, and I think the other thing is it used to be when you would watch on election night, they would look at a state and go, okay, now what we're seeing is the southern half of the state, they always report earlier than the western part. And so what you're seeing are votes coming in favor of one candidate because he or she was more popular in the south, but the western part of the state will be for it. So you would see those different movements. But this is a whole another more intricate layer of that, which will make the numbers move differently during the evening. And that's why there's, I think, confusion, or people are concerned that, oh, wait a minute, my guy was ahead. Now suddenly he's way behind. What happened here? There's something not right here. What went on? That kind of a thing. But you're trying to say, look, that's normally been the case anyhow. We just haven't seen the sausage being made in the background like it is, like we're now more aware of it, I guess.
That's right. And it really is because while millions of people have voted in every presidential absentee, I mean, you think of Americans who live overseas, the U.S. military, there's absentee balloting, absentee mail-in voting by college students who prefer to vote in, where they grew up as opposed to where they are on campus, right? So that's always happened.
Right.
Just not in the volume that we're seeing in 2020, because now it's not just military and Americans overseas and college students. Now it's a whole lot of people who are not wanting to stand in line at a polling place and potentially pick up the coronavirus. So the volume of mailed in ballots that have to be processed is extraordinary. The last thing I'll say on this state by state difference, which is interesting, is even the deadline for counting of the ballots. It differs by state. So Ohio, under Ohio law, there are 14 days to count the ballots. In Michigan, it's 21 days. In Iowa, it's 27 days. So every state, I think we're going to be seeing in the days after the election, this rolling process of states. Now, the caveat is if it's some kind of a landslide within individual states where Donald Trump just walked walks away with it, and it's not going to be days to know, because election officials will say, okay, well, we've got 250,000 ballots left to count, but the president has already won by more than that, right? Or you kind of get the idea. Or California, Joe Biden is going to win California, and if the votes that have been counted by election day show landslide territory for Joe Biden, as they likely will, then you won't necessarily have to wait for the mailed-in ballots all to be counted. But in the toss-up states like Ohio, you will probably have to wait to find out what the outcome is.
Yeah. And I know when I was talking with people from the Board of Elections, they were encouraging people at that time to vote early, because they can, in Ohio, process, actually begin counting those ballots, as opposed to everybody shows up on election day and votes, which means that's until you cast your vote, they can't count it. They could actually do the pre-counting or the pre-tabulating of the earlier voting. So that's why they were encouraged, because they don't want to try and count everything on election day, because they know it's going to be an exciting day. It would be a nice way to put it, I guess, for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it always is an exciting day on election day. I think what we're looking at is going to be an exciting week, or potentially 2-week period. One thing that I found interesting that I heard anecdotally is that there has been not just a tremendous amount of requests for absentee ballots, but also big lines at early voting centers.
Right.
Lucas County has especially long lines. Wood County has had long lines as well, but the wait hasn't been as long. We're smaller in population. That could be part of it, right? But some of the anecdotal evidence is that some people who requested mail ballots have decided instead to go and vote early. They feel like there's just less room for error if they forget to use the right envelope or something with a mail-in ballot. They're nervous about having that ballot count, so they're showing up early. Now, in Ohio, if you do that, which is fine, you do have to vote provisionally, which means you'll be filling out a paper ballot, but you will be handing it directly to an election official, right? It'll get counted, but that's slowing down some of these lines at the election centers, one per county in each of the 88 counties. That slows things down when you get a bunch of people showing up to vote provisionally. But again, you can see why, with a lot of the news about mail-in ballots, and there's so many, and if you make this little error, it might not get counted. So that's forcing some people to say, you know what, I think I'll go vote provisionally in person.
Okay. Now, we've talked about Ohio. Is it your thought that Ohio will predict the next president? So if we see, whenever Ohio actually reports its count, I mean, do we think that'll hold true or not? I know we're speculating. We're taking a shot in the dark here, kind of. But yeah,
I'm stumbling here, Steve, because this is such a tough one.
It's a loaded question. Yeah.
Normally, I would say yes. With the kind of record that Ohio has, I would say yes normally, right?
But this isn't a normal election.
Right. And this is the thing that I think Joe Biden can win without Ohio, and he may well win without Ohio.
Okay. Well,
I think the president can't win without Ohio.
Okay. We'll leave it right there. Okay. We'll leave it there, and we'll see what we'll know, and maybe we'll be back. Who knows? In a few weeks after the election, still talking about who's going to be the president of the United States. Hopefully that won't be the case, but it could. So, Dr. Melissa Miller, thank you so much from Bowling Green State University for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And you can join us every week on The Journal here on WBGU-PBS. And of course, you can catch us on WBGU.org as well, and all the social media. We'll see you again next time on The Journal.